After the war, my father took us as a family to Egg, and we had a home there for 15 years. But unfortunately, although every other family in the island was Gaelic speaking, we were not, and we remained monoglot. And so I have to apologise for that. But there were people who did travel the islands and did collect a lot of traditions and songs and prayers and blessings. And this is just one of 5 volumes collected by one man, Alexander Carmichael. And he was from Lismore, and he was an Episcopalian. And there he is. And he actually collected for 60 years in the last half of the 19th century, and in the Outer Isles, mostly in the Outer Isles. The Outer Isles at that time numbered about 44,000 people, but they were all crowded into the west side of the island, the ones who had not been cleared to Canada, and they were in the worst part of the worst land, and they were crowded like sheep in a pen, as he said. And but he was able to collect really not songs, because he was not musical, but and because there were no recording machines then, he collected, these are just volumes of prayers and blessings, and so they're all what he could take down, I think, dictated to him. And I just thought I would read. There's a rune before prayer, before you even began praying, to give you a flavour of it, and it's in English, of course, because the Gaelic's on one side and the English is on the other. I'm bending my knee in the eye of the Father who created me, in the eye of the Son who purchased me, in the eye of the Spirit who cleansed me, in friendship and affection, through thine own anointed one, O God, bestow upon us fullness in our need, love towards God, the affection of God, the smile of God, the wisdom of God, the grace of God, the fear of God, and the will of God, to do on the world of the three as angels and saints do in heaven, each shade and light, each day and night, each time in kindness, give thou us thy Spirit. And as he said, old people in the Isles sing this or some other short hymn before prayer. Sometimes the hymn and the prayer are intoned. They generally retire to an outhouse or the lee of a knoll or the shelter of a dell, that they may not be seen or heard of men. I've known men and women of 80, 90 and 100 years of age continue the practice of their lives in going from 1 to 2 miles to the seashore to join their voices with the voicing of the waves and their praises with the praises of the ceaseless sea. And these blessings cover everything: herding cattle, herding sheep, grinding corn, sowing corn, every season of the year, all the feast days, Christmas, and the great feast day was the Feast of St. Michael, the 29th of September, and that probably had much older traditions. You were allowed the night before the Feast of St. Michael to take or borrow any horse from anyone else, so long as you left them one horse, that they could get to the races the next day. So after foregathering for Mass, by that time everyone had pinched all the horses they needed. They set off for the sands. And I think in Ireland they had the same celebrations at the Feast of St. Michael. And there are prayers to cover every eventuality. And I like the one for people who, especially if you can't sleep. This is the bed blessing. I am lying down tonight with Mary mild and with her Son, with the mother of my King, who is shielding me from harm. I will not lie down with evil, nor shall evil lie down with me, but I will lie down with God, and God will lie down with me. God and Mary and Michael kindly, and the cross of the 9 angels fair, be shielding me as 3 and as 1, from the brow of my face to the edge of my soles. I beseech Peter, I beseech Paul, I beseech Mary, I beseech the Son, I beseech the trustful apostles 12, to preserve me from hurt and harm, oh, from dying tonight, from dying tonight. O God, O Mary of glory, O Jesus, Son of the Virgin fragrant, save ye us from the pains everlasting, and from the fire fierce and murky, from the pains everlasting, and from the fire fierce and murky. I think what Alexander, one of the things that impressed him so much was that he said, these tales and poems have been an education to me, and so have the men and women from whose dictation I wrote them down. The product of faraway thinking, come down on the long stream of time. Who the thinkers whence the stream? Who can tell? Some of the hymns may have been composed within the cloistered cells of Derry, and some of the incantations among the standing stones of Callanish. These poems were composed by the learned, but they have not come down through the lettered few, but through the unlettered many, through the crofters and cotters, the herdsmen and shepherds of the highlands and islands. And I think that someone who followed him quite quickly, Carmichael was an Episcopalian, but Father Alan MacDonald, as you know, was first and foremost a parish priest, and he himself became a poet and to some degree a bard, and he collected the songs and stories of South Uist, but also above all in Eriskay. And he often regretted that he had been born and brought up in Fort William, that if he'd been a few miles further west, he would have grown up in a Gaelic-speaking community, but people were already speaking a lot of English in Fort William at that time. And although both his parents were Gaels, and anyway, at 12 he was sent east to Blair's, but in Blair's, Gaelic was frowned upon, and they were not supposed to speak it, even though most of the seminarians had come from the Western Isles. However, once they got away to Valladolid, there weren't any of the same inhibitions, and he threw himself into Gaelic. And then his first appointment was to Open, and then next to South Uist, where the exigencies of looking after the parish and a lot of political troubles too, his health went, and the bishop wanted to recall him to Open, but he asked for Eriskay instead. And Eriskay was not much more than a rock for most of the people were fishermen, and he was absolutely delighted with the people that he was in charge of. And the first thing he did was to build a new church, which is still the church in Eriskay. And he was very touched by their habit of bursting into song for all sadnesses and all gladnesses. And they were an island full of singers. And he himself, he translated hymns for them. He translated Thomas Aquinas's prayers for the Mass into Gaelic poetry, and for them to sing during Mass. He translated a lot of hymns. He wrote hymns and poems, and he would do very witty things at their weddings and things. So he was even a bard. And I thought I would read you some of his poetry. One of his long poems to Our Lady. And there's, of course, it's not in Gaelic, it's only in translation. He said, "Crouched round the world, the night is gentle, like a mother watching her children sleep. More gentle's your bosom, O lovely Mary, as you lullaby Christ with your heart to his cheek. Lightning can travel round the world before an eye can see it moving a step. My lady would think that its speed was slow when she comes down to help in time of need. Did we hear the sound of thunder aloft, shaking mountains to their foundations? Its voice is as naught to the Virgin's fame. They are heard together in every land. I see the lovely bow as a bridge, that's what my mind puts into my thoughts, and that Mary's the rainbow of my King, our path to peace and our salvation. No matter how deep is your bed, O sea, whose waves are a white belt round the world, deeper, O Mary, is the sea of your grief, and wider your mercy to mankind." And he had other, of course, it wasn't all picnic in in Eriskay. There's a small poem about rough, gloomy weather. As is usual in wolf time, white spindrift from sandbanks being pursued round the world, sea spray like ashes driven over the sound, sods and slates being loosened by the punching of wind. Fierce squalls from the north are shaking each gable, hard enough hailstones to slice the tips of your ears. Folks so numb with the cold that they can't look outside are indoors by the ashes, huddled up close. So anyway, the exigencies of being a parish priest in Eriskay, he actually died when he was only in his late 40s. And he did offer a lot of his collection and stuff to Carmichael, but Carmichael had more than enough of his own. However, and none of his work would have survived if it hadn't been for John Lorne Campbell of Canna. And John Lorne Campbell was a quite different character to anyone we've been talking about. And his background was, he was a Campbell from Lochfine, and his background was rather grand, and his people owed their money and their status really to having supported the Hanoverians and being anti-Jacobite. And so he grew up in an English-speaking family, and he was sent to Rugby and to Oxford, and Gaelic was not approved of in any or anything of that. And but his life changed when he took a steamer to Barra for a 3-week holiday, and when he got there, he stayed for 5 years. And he found there there was Compton Mackenzie, there was John Macpherson, who was the Coddy, who taught him Gaelic. And I think Mackenzie gave him a lot of confidence because he produced the Book of Bara, and he'd already actually, while he was at university, edited a book of Jacobite songs, which he'd collected. And this didn't meet with much approval, but anyway. But in Bara, the people in Bara gave him a new lease of life. It's just as you were talking about, it's the culture well, and their hospitality. And he and Compton Mackenzie, they worked politically too, especially John did. They tried to, they proposed a sort of Highlands and Islands Development Board, but that was 30 years before it became thought of. He worked very hard on the Sea League to try and get the fisheries protected, but that's about 50 years before anything had been done about that. And they even tried to have equal tariffs with the ferries as with the roads, and that has taken 70 years to come off. So they obviously felt they failed in all that. And later, he bought the island of Canna, and he had a home in the Hebrides really for the rest of his life. And then he lived on Canna with his wife, and they farmed, he farmed, and he collected an enormous Gaelic library actually, and he and his wife also, he collected stories, and they and eventually, well, the war came, and there was the exigencies of wartime on an island and of farming, and eventually he was, anyway, he was so hard up, they gave it to the National Trust. So it may still be visited, and in Canna House you can still find Father Allen's work and all the work that they also produced. And his wife was Margaret Fay Shaw. She was American, and she was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She used to say she was made of Pittsburgh steel. And she had a wonderful, gravelly American voice. She was tiny, but she had a great art of saying things as they really are. But and strangely, she'd been sent over to Helensburgh as a child to board in a school, in a school. And it was in that school that she first heard Margaret Kennedy Fraser singing. And years later, after studying music in New York and giving up the idea of being a concert pianist, she set off for this country and with a bicycle went to Skye and thereafter to South Uist, where she found a home with two elderly sisters, Peggy and Mary McCrae, and they taught her Gaelic, they gave her the songs, they introduced her to all the other people in South Uist, and she, being musical, she was very, very, which Carmichael was not at all. She was very careful in taking down the right notation for the Gaelic songs and in singing. And she did, John Campbell visited Loch Boysdale and met her. And as she said, no one was more surprised than she was when he asked her to marry her. He was a very shy, diffident man. He didn't have many social graces. But anyway, they married, and their first home was a boat, which when they anchored it in the bay one day in the bay in Barra, she noticed the Catholic Church seemed to be passing, and then after a while it seemed a bit closer, and it was passing the other direction. And so she called up to him because he was busy typing with all his papers and that, and telling him what has happened, and he just replied, "Oh, you're always worrying about something." And so they went back and forth about 4 times. They were practically on the shore, and luckily people started jumping up and down on the shore and waving to them. So then he was roused, and they managed to get the typewriter and the papers into the dinghy and get to the shore. I only mention that because I can't find out, in spite of the biography and autobiography, when or why they became Catholics, and perhaps it doesn't matter because these things are mysterious anyway, and perhaps it was a foresight of them coming closer and closer, and probably it was because they took root in an honourable people in Barra and the other islands. And Margaret, she survived. She was over 100 by the time she died, but the Canna House, with all its papers and the Gaelic library, can be visited. And but their paths did pass. They didn't know Callum MacLean. I don't know if you know about Callum. He was born on the Isle of Razi. He was a Gaelic speaker, and he was one of 5 sons, 2 of whom became doctors, and 2 of them became headmasters of secondary schools. One of them was Sorley MacLean, the poet. And Callum, he was very small and he was slightly deaf. But anyway, he studied Celtic under Carmichael's son, I think, or grandson, no, son-in-law in Edinburgh. And he gained a scholarship and went off to University College in Dublin to study modern Welsh and early Irish. But then the war came and all that came to an end. But he was in Ireland and he had to find a livelihood there. And he was drawn to Connemara because west of Galway City, Irish was still generally talked. So he got in touch with the Irish Folklore Commission and asked if he could work from them. And between 1942 and 1945, he collected at least 6 volumes of material for them, which he deposited with them. And then they sent him to Scotland. So he collected in Razi and Egg and Canna and Benbecula and South Uist. And at last, people perhaps began to think that there could be such a thing as a School of Scottish Studies, and it was set up in 1951. Perhaps it was because Callum was doing so much work for the Irish that they got him to come. So he was in at the foundation of that. But what he collected was far more than even Carmichael had ever collected, even though he came so late on the scene and there were fewer Gaelic speakers. But he did have recording machine, wax machines. And he did travel in South Uist again, and he took whole stories, many of which lasted 7 to 9 hours, and some are whole nights. And I think they realized then that this, and what he said, many of the tellers said they had not a third of the of the tales that their fathers had had. Angus MacLennan of Griminish, who could neither read nor write, but was endowed with a prodigious memory, and some of his tales took from 7 to 9 hours to narrate. And if they would wait to break off, he would take off on again the next day exactly where they had left off. They never... Duncan MacDonald of Penareen, South Uist, the greatest stylist among the storytellers, a master of the art. His command of the language is magnificent. And then John MacDonald, a roadman of Loch Arbor, from whom he recorded a total of 524 tales during his first 5 months with the School of Scottish Studies. He said he seems to know everything that took place in Loch Arbor. He can give the date of almost every battle and clan fight as far back as the 15th century, almost to the exact date and month of the year. But he said, it was in Glenroy I found the only Gaelic speakers under 40 years of age. There also I found one of the best traditional fiddlers in Loch Arbor. With Glenroy, a language, a culture, a civilization passes into oblivion. But what is interesting, I think, is Callum wrote that much had been said about the part evangelical Calvinism had played in the destruction of Gaelic folk tales, music and beliefs. But he felt it to be only one of several contributory factors. I think that's interesting, that the iconoclasm that you were talking of fairly came in with the Calvinistic thing, and a lot of Calvinistic missionaries from Northern Ireland were arrived. Even in the 1920s, there was a large bonfire of all the musical instruments they could collect in Skye was burnt. So it had a long... But Callum maintains, and I thought this was interesting, he said, much has been said and written about the part that evangelical Calvinism played in the destruction of Gaelic folk tales, folk music, beliefs and customs. But he says, as he called it, the faith not of Columba but of Cromwell. He said John Lon Campbell of Canna stated that he and other collaborators recorded 200 songs from the natives of Catholic Isles of Barra and Eriskay alone. And the population of these two islands is over 2,500. But in the winter of 1945-46, I recorded 199 songs from 2 households in the completely seceded island of Razi, which has a population of less than 300. And then during a short summer vacation in 1949, Miss Elizabeth Allen, a Glasgow school teacher, recorded 250 songs in the half-Gaelic, half-Church of Scotland island of Benbecula. And Fred Macaulay recorded 280 songs in the strongly seceded and wee free Isle of Harris. And recently, hundreds of songs have been recorded in Lewis, as well as the whole western seaboard from Lorne northwards to Durness in Sutherlandshire. And he had noticed that the contribution of adherents of the Free Church is very large indeed. And he does say, the tolerant Catholic, he said, I have met dozens of seceders and wee frees, as well as Catholics, who swear that they have seen fairies, not to speak of apparitions and omens, and will not go out on in boats along with ministers, red-haired women and hens. The tolerant Catholic clergy smiled benignly at their flock when they told stories, sang songs, danced and played the bagpipes and fiddles. They even went so far as to encourage them to uphold their rich cultural heritage, and they and their people deserve much credit for the fact that so much of it remains with us today. Far greater credit is due, however, to the noble tradition bearers in the Presbyterian areas who clung to that same rich heritage despite decades of evangelical thundering and the threat of eternal damnation. Well, but Callum had become a Catholic way back when he was in Ireland. But, I think maybe I'll just tell you, say what Carmichael said. And he was, remembering he was collecting in a time of great poverty and hardship. People were good to the poor, kind to the stranger, and courteous to all. During all the years that I have lived and travelled among them, night and day, I never met with any incivility, never with rudeness, never with vulgarity, never with aught but courtesy. I never entered a house without the inmates offering me food or apologising for want of it. Callum's brother, Sorley, Callum died. He had cancer, but he didn't talk about it, and went eventually to South Uist and died in Dalyborough Hospital. And Sorley did a poem about Callum, write a poem about Callum, about 27 verses long it is, but he says, I can hardly think that a Gael lives and that you are not to be found between Grimsay and the Sound, kindling ancient memory with kindness and fun. Often do I ask of my own heart if it was the creed of Rome or rare hardihood in your kind that put your heroism to its height, as it were without effort.